Guess I'll introduce myself real quick. My name is Cameron. I'm a paramedic with Frank County EMS. Who's been in one of these classes before? I know a lot of the Carnival guys have. Does anybody know what you're here for, TC3? Raise your hand if you've never heard of TC3 before. Or Tccc. Okay. Let me get one of you guys to tell me what you think you're here for tonight. Sir, you mind? Okay, that's exactly right. Okay, so TC3, everybody's seen the movie Black Hawk Down, right? Okay, so TC3 is basically, I guess you could say, a modality, a thought process of how to approach combat medicine in a tactical environment. So what was happening was that treatment of casualties was getting pushed to the priority rather than killing the bad guy or responding to a threat. And so what TC3 does is basically puts medical interventions in their rightful place, which is secondary to responding to like an active shooter. So that's absolutely right. And TC3 is an excellent resource, excellent training class to use if you're trying to up your game on active shooter events. We'll go ahead and get started. At any time, if you have any questions, just stop me, and I'll answer them. Tonight's pretty much going to be mostly lecture. As far as I know, there might be some, we might have some tourniquet application stuff, and then tomorrow, hopefully, we'll just do some culminating scenarios, what you guys run through, what you've learned tonight. All right, let's get started. All right, so TC3 is just a kind of slick way of saying Tccc, Tactical Combat Casualty Care. That's what TC3 stands for. This is going to be the All Service Members course, which is basically the most basic TC3 course that the military offers. There's the All Service Members course, which all military service members have to take. There's the Combat Lifesaver course, which each unit will decide who becomes a combat lifesaver. There's the medic / corpsman, and then there's the paramedic. So this is going to be the entry level TC3 course. So nothing crazy, basically bleeding control and basic airway maneuvers. How many EMRs or EMTs do we have in here? Anybody else have any medical experience at all? Even first responding to calls with Frank County EMS or other EMS agencies?
Most of them others first responders.
Okay. All right. So we're going to watch a quick video basically introducing you to TC3 here. And we'll roll down the slides.
Medical emergency.
We got 3 to get on him.
All right, so basically the gist of that video is kind of loosely broke down the phases. What TC3 does to make sure that medical interventions are done at the appropriate time and in the appropriate places it breaks the situation in 3 phases. Okay, so you have the care under fire phase, which is phase 1. This is your initial phase where your scene is still unsafe. Okay, this is where there's still a shooter. He's still killing people. And phase 1 is all about killing him first. The only treatment that we apply in phase 1 when we're still unsafe is a hasty tourniquet. And what a hasty tourniquet is, has anybody ever messed with tourniquets at all? Let me go to the slide real quick and get you some. Okay, so here's your 3 phases of TC3. Like I said, you got care under fire, which is your phase. That's the initial threat. The threat's not taken care of. The first thing we want to do is kill the bad guy, is eliminate the threat, and identify and treat any life-threatening bleeding. So you'll learn later on there's different ways you can apply a tourniquet. What we're doing in care under fire is applying what's called a hasty tourniquet. So if we're running through an active shooter scenario and we're trying to find the threat and we see our buddy is down with massive bleeding to his right leg, we're not going to go and, well, first of all, if he can treat himself, we're gonna make him do that. If we're going to do anything, it's going to be apply a hasty tourniquet, which is we're not going to expose the leg. We're basically, okay, so I see blood, I'm going to put a tourniquet as high on that leg as possible to make sure that, because at this point I don't know where the injury is really. I see blood, and I know he needs some bleeding control, and we're going to do something that's fast, and so I can get back to doing what I need to be doing. So we're going to put the tourniquet high and tight, as high on the extremity as you can, and as tight as you can. Okay, and after that, we're going to leave him, and we're going to continue our job of eliminating the threat. And I would actually add a caveat to that. Everybody knows the name Benjamin Netanyahu, right? Prime Minister of Israel. So he actually had a brother. His brother was killed in a tactical operation, hostage rescue situation. I think it was an airport. They were basically assaulting the compound. His brother was hit, and his team did something that was a little bit controversial at that time. They left it. They rendered no aid, and provided no medical treatments to him. They kept assaulting the compound. And so that's the caveat I would add with identify and control life-threatening bleeding, is if you're in a firefight, your number 1 priority is to take the other guy out. Even if your buddy or another first responder is with you, your priority is to make that scene safe. Because if you take time to apply a hasty tourniquet now in a situation that's unsafe, you're putting yourself at further risk, and that's just going to lead to more casualties. And that's what the military found, is that when medicine is delivered at the wrong time, it leads to increased casualties. So everybody's number 1 job in phase 1 of TC3 is eliminating the threat. And I'm sure how many police officers we got here? I know we got Scott Andrews right here. Is that about what y'all just got in GSB? I mean, if you have somebody shooting at you, you're not going to stop to render aid, right? Your primary focus is to eliminate the threat, and we're trying to prevent further loss of life. So that's your number one focus in phase one of TC3. You can't beat that home enough. We want to take out the bad guy or take out the threat, and then afterwards we can identify, control life-threatening bleeding. Any questions? Okay, so this basically breaks down phase one like I just broke it down to you. We're emphasizing scene safety, hasty tourniquet, high and tight on the wounded extremity, and casualty movement, which once again, we're keeping in mind that we're always going back to scene safety. And if the threat is not eliminated, we never have a truly safe scene. So we need to limit the amount of medical attention and medical aid we're delivering to casualties at this point, because we still have a threat. Okay, phase two of tactical field care is tactical field care. At this point, we're assuming we're at a position in the incident where the threat's been eliminated, or at least put into a position to where he's no longer a threat to us. It sort of opens us up to do to accomplish more medical interventions safely. Has everybody ever heard of the acronym MARCH? So MARCH is a great way to remember a rapid casualty assessment. I still use MARCH. You have massive bleeding, which is always number one priority. Why? Because massive bleeding is going to kill the person first. Followed by airway, which usually airway compromise is going to kill the person second. Respirations, breathing, circulation, and hypothermia. And then obviously you have your secondary injuries. So MARCH is a great way to go ahead and ingrain that into your mind when you're assessing a casualty. The MARCH acronym gives you your priority of care. So like I'm sure everybody's a firefighter in here, right? Okay. I'm trying to find a way to. So I'm sure on a fire scene, you guys have your priorities. The chief has his priorities once he gets on scene. He's not going to do a secondary task before he accomplishes a primary goal. I have no experience in fire, so I don't know what those tasks might be, but I'm sure y'all have some tasks that are more important that need to be done first. And then once those things are done, you then follow down, your order of march into those secondary tasks. And that's what MARCH gives you. It gives you a simple to remember: massive bleeding, airway, respiration, breathing, circulation, and hypothermia. These are the things that are going to kill the patient, and in that order. All right, massive bleeding. Can I get a volunteer to tell me what they think massive bleeding is?
Squirting blood.
Squirting blood. That's a great, yeah. So any kind of squirting, pulsatile blood. Obviously, if you get up to a patient, they're just in a pool of blood, you would call that massive bleeding too. But yeah, Clayton's exactly right. Any kind of, we call it arterial hemorrhage. So you have two sides of your circulation. You have the venous side, which is your low pressure system, and then you have your arterial side, which is your high pressure system. And everybody can feel on your neck. You can feel your carotid pulse, and it has a pulse because it's the arterial side of things, and it's under high pressure. Because it's under high pressure, think about a hydraulic system. So if you have a high pressure hydraulic system versus a low pressure hydraulic system, we're worried more about a bust in the seam of a high pressure hydraulic system, right? Than we are maybe a low pressure, just because it's under such high pressure that it's gonna really shoot out. Same thing with the body. The arterial side of things, you can bleed out in as little as 3 minutes, I think it is, from the femoral artery, and that's the artery that runs down your thigh. Okay, How to recognize bright red blood. The blood is bright red because it's oxygenated, because it's on the arterial side of things. It's pushing oxygenated blood to your extremities, to your brain, to the rest of your body to provide nutrients for your cells. So that's why it's bright red as opposed to a dark red. Pulsing, spurting, or steady bleeding from the wound. Some other signs that you might look for, other than like if they have clothes on, or your overlying clothing is or bandage is soaked with blood. That's not good. Cotton can absorb a lot of blood. So if you see a bandage that's soaked through with blood, especially if it's a heftier bandage, you know that you have a lot of bleeding going on. And obviously your amputations are going to be your massive bleeding as well. Okay, so we have basically 3 tools that we can effectively treat massive bleeding with. We have the tourniquet, which I'll pass around some tourniquets now. Clayton's not giving me a hand. Y'all just pass those around. Does anybody have a tourniquet in their car or tourniquets at your house? No?
Yeah. Several of those they gave out.
Yeah. The stop bleeding stuff? Yeah. Okay, so what's going around is called the Combat Application Tourniquet, CAT for short. I think these are Gen 6s. There's 7 generations of them. They've been around for more than a decade, I think. It's always been my go-to tourniquet. Talking with guys overseas, my last deployment, they preferred the CAT tourniquet. It's the easiest to use. There's other tourniquets out there that have a heftier windlass, like the Soft T. I think Sam makes a tourniquet, but what I've found, the CAT, it works, and it's simple, and it's been proven to work. Several over decades, it's been proven to work. You can get CAT tourniquets online. I don't think you need a medical authorization for just a tourniquet. They usually run anywhere from $30 to $60. This is one of those things where you don't want to do a Walmart version of the CAT tourniquet. You want to get name brand, because that name brand has been approved. Right? It's going through the proper testing to make sure it's not going to fail. So we have, to control massive bleeding, we have the tourniquet, which is great for extremity hemorrhage. We have hemostatic dressing, and that word hemostatic right there, it just means it's a cotton gauze that's been infused with an active agent to either promote the body's own clotting mechanisms or to cause clotting. If you don't have access to a hemostatic dressing, just cotton gauze. Cotton gauze will do. And then you have the pressure bandage, which is basically ACE wrap, or you can buy So pressure bandage, they come in, just like everything, they come in all shapes and sizes. some pressure bandages will have will have like a plastic mechanism on them that will aid in applying pressure to the wound. I don't think the ones I passed out to you have the pressure device on them. But you can make your own. The pressure bandages can run a little costly. You can make your own from Walmart supplies, Ace Wrap and cotton bandages, and you put those things together, and you've got a solid pressure bandage. Like we don't have pressure bandages on the ambulances. We have Ace Wrap and cotton gauze. So these are the three main things we're going to use in TC3 to control massive bleeding. All right, go with the combat application tourniquet. The rod you see on the cat tourniquet is called the windlass. You have the windlass clip, which secures the rod after you tighten. You have the routing buckle, and you have the safety strap. All right, tourniquet application. Tourniquet cuts off blood flow to an arm or leg past the application site. It's the best method to control massive bleeding. Obviously, you can't put a tourniquet anywhere except for one of the four extremities of the body. You don't want to apply it to the neck. That's always a big joke. So yeah, this is only going to go on one of your four extremities. One thing you need to remember is whenever you apply a tourniquet onto somebody, it needs to be at least 2 to 3 inches above the wound. You have your different applications over here to the right. You have your care under fire, which, does anybody remember which phase care under fire was?
First phase.
Yep, that's phase 1. So care under fire for a high threat. So we're going to apply the tourniquet high and tight on the wounded extremity. Actually, plate and limit there, I'll demonstrate that real quick. Toss me out. Okay, so when we say high and tight on the extremity, what we're doing is we're moving the band as high and as tight up on the extremity as we can, because we want to do it fast. All right. We're going to tighten the tourniquet as tight as we can get it with just the band. All right. And the reason we do that is we only have a certain amount of tightening distance we have with this rod right here. So we don't want to have to take up any slack in the band to apply the tourniquet. So we're getting this thing as tight as we can. We'll go ahead and wrap that around, and then we start tightening. Now, one of the rules for applying a tourniquet is we're getting rid of all blood flow to the extremity. So you keep tightening until blood stops. And if it doesn't stop, you put a second tourniquet on. If the second tourniquet doesn't work, you start trying to do some pressure or bandage or something like that. But obviously this is a hasty tourniquet, so if one tourniquet doesn't work, we're probably going to leave the guy and keep doing what we need to do. Once you tighten to get rid of, to control bleeding, you'll pull your safety strap right here. The windlass goes into the buckle like that, and then you'll take the rest of your strap, route it through the buckle, cover it, and time it. And that would be your hasty application of a tourniquet. And when do we apply a hasty tourniquet? Right, care under fire, because it's fast, so you can usually do it in less than a minute. All right, the tactical field care tourniquet is called a deliberate tourniquet, and the reason it's called deliberate is at this point, everybody remember what phase tactical field care is?
Phase 2.
Phase 2, that's right. So at this point, the threat has been eliminated, or we're in a spot where either the IC or someone in command has stated the scene is relatively safe. We can start into tactical field care and start treating some folks. Does everybody remember the algorithm or the acronym we're going to use to rapidly assess a patient? March, that's right. So what are we looking for first? What's the M? Massive bleeding, that's right. And so once we see massive bleeding, we're gonna go for it. We're gonna expose the wound. At this point, it's called deliberate because we're ripping clothing. We wanna see what the wound is, where it's at, and we're gonna apply a tourniquet to that specific wound rather than to the entire extremity. And that's why it's called deliberate. So say somebody had some clothing on and they had some massive bleeding coming from their calf right here, but we put a hasty tourniquet on. Well, in care under fire, they would get a hasty tourniquet because they have the clothing on. With a deliberate tourniquet, we're gonna come in, we're gonna expose the wound, see what's going on, and we put the tourniquet closer to the wound, 2 to 3 inches above the wound. And so that would be a deliberate tourniquet. So those are the differences between a deliberate tourniquet and a hasty tourniquet. A hasty tourniquet, we don't care where the wound is. We know that it's bleeding, and we know that it's bleeding in one of the extremities. And so we're gonna apply something high and tight as fast as we can, get back to doing what we need to do. With a deliberate tourniquet, we're going through our patient assessment. We're assessing for massive hemorrhage, and we wanna know what kind of wound it is, and we wanna apply that deliberate tourniquet to that wound, okay? Apply a second tourniquet if bleeding is not stopped with one tourniquet properly applied. When it says properly applied, that's what I'm talking about. The band needs to be fully secured. We need to go as tight as we can on the band first. One of the things you'll find is there's a little band right here. I don't know if you all have y'all's tourniquets. You see that right there? There's a band, it's kind of a band within a band. So you have this band that goes within the main band. You see how crinkled that band is right now? Well, that's because as I pull this band, the band that's within the band pulls the band tight, and that's how you put pressure on your arteries to stop the bleeding. And if this happens, if you have all this slack right here, when you go to apply the tourniquet, that's just more slack you have to take up, right? It gives you less room to tighten down your tourniquet. So one thing I like to do to make sure my tourniquet is staged is I just give it a little pop. Just grab the buckle end right there, grab this end, and you just pop the bands, and see how the band is laying nice and flat on the plate, the plastic plate now. So now when I go to put the tourniquet on, I don't only have to go a quarter turn and I already start meeting resistance. And it's gonna be that much faster and that much more effective. So that's what we're talking about, an effective, properly applied tourniquet. To apply a second tourniquet, you're going right beside the one you just applied, with no space in between tourniquets, okay? One thing I would note is say I had a wound where my watch was, or say I had an amputation at the wrist, and somebody applied a tourniquet 2 inches above that wound, but it's not stopping the bleeding. We're gonna go above or below our first tourniquet. Above, exactly right. Because we wanna keep that distance, that space, that safe space we have between the wound and the tourniquet. We wanna keep that 2 to 3 inches of standoff distance. Okay, this is just going over some common errors when performing a tourniquet application. The self-adhering strap not pulled tight enough. That's what I'm talking about. Cinching that band down as much as you can before you start tightening the windlass. Windlass rod, not twisted tight enough to stop the bleeding. One thing you'll find when you properly apply a tourniquet is that the patient will be in more pain from the tourniquet than the actual wound. We had a guy one time, anybody ever mess with table routers in here? So he was operating a big handheld table router, and he didn't know that it was turned on, and he was going to plug it in, but it was already turned on. So as soon as he went to plug it in, it jumped up his bicep, and basically it just ate his bicep. Ate his bicep completely up. I mean, his bicep was just hanging off of it. Once we put the tourniquet on, you know what he was complaining about? The tourniquet. He was asking us to loosen the tourniquet. And he had all this stuff. He had massive hemorrhage, he had spurting red blood coming from right under his bicep brachial artery. He got an artery that runs right under the bicep. But he was more worried about the tourniquet than he was his initial complaint, okay? And this is something that we found, this is something that has actually killed soldiers overseas, because they'll go to loosen the tourniquet to alleviate their pain, and they will bleed, they will re-bleed. So once we put the tourniquet on, only medical professionals take the tourniquet off, okay? So that's gonna be a solid rule. Once a first responder puts the tourniquet on, it's there, okay, until a medical professional comes, reassesses it, and decides whether or not it stays or gets moved. Tourniquet not applied fast enough. Obviously, people only have so much blood in their bodies. If you don't get it on fast enough, there's a time limit. So if they bleed out before you get the tourniquet on, then you're probably gonna die, right? Everybody understands that, right? It's pretty self-explanatory. Anybody ever heard of an improvised tourniquet before? I would probably recommend, improvised tourniquets are a very, very secondary, tertiary way of controlling bleeding. Firstly, because they're not made specifically to control bleeding, to use muscle and bone to constrict and put pressure on blood vessels. So like say a belt, you can put a belt on somebody, but you're probably not gonna cinch that belt tight enough to constrict arterial blood vessels. And that's why we have the windlass rod on these tourniquets. Is we can take that and apply some leverage to that band and really cinch that thing down. You can't really do that with a leather belt, because the leather belt isn't gonna move. It's not gonna move with you. So I would just recommend go ahead and getting some tourniquets. I don't even know how many tourniquets I have. A good many. But yeah, be very careful when using improvised tourniquets. Let's see. Okay. So we have tourniquets for massive hemorrhage, and we have wound packing. And this, everybody remember the hemostatic dressing I was talking about? So for wounds that you can't put a tourniquet on, say the abdomen, the neck, junctional areas where the extremities come up and meet the core of the body, your armpits, your groin, buttocks, high thigh, those are all gonna be areas that we can't get the tourniquet high enough to work, right? And so we need an alternate means of controlling that bleeding. And one of the things we can use is gauze. We can pack the wound, which is basically exactly how it sounds. When you're packing a wound, you're basically looking into the wound, you're seeing your massive hemorrhage, you're gonna go for the spot of most hemorrhage, and you're just gonna pack. We'll do a demonstration tomorrow, we'll actually get you guys, we'll do a little packing exercise, it's pretty cool. And you're just gonna pack that wound. So for massive bleeding that cannot be controlled with a tourniquet, we're gonna go to wound packing with either an infused hemostatic gauze or just a cotton gauze or a shirt, whatever you can find, right? Okay, and this little ace bandage you see right here is them basically taking their wound packing and now they're securing it, right? So what are the 2 ways we can, or 3 ways we can treat massive hemorrhage? What's our primary? Tourniquet. And that's for use on which parts of the body? Extremities. There we go. Arms, legs. What's our secondary if we can't apply a tourniquet to control the bleeding? For massive hemorrhage. Wound pack. That's exactly right. And then we have pressure bandages, which those should have circulated already. Okay, any questions on, massive bleeding? So, massive bleeding is gonna be, if you guys are trying to set yourselves up to first respond, massive bleeding is going to be the most important thing when you're responding to any kind of active shooter incident, because it's gonna be what kills people. It's gonna be the most deadliest cause of, well, it's gonna kill the most people. Cause of death. Oh, man, it's late. Anyway, and hopefully by the time y'all even get to airway, we're showing up. So as first responders, your bread and butter is gonna be early CPR, and tourniquet application. And when I kind of jumped, but when I say CPR, we're no longer talking like active shooter, right? We're talking more like your medical stuff that y'all respond to. But for an MCI where you have an active shooter, massive hemorrhage is gonna be the number one thing as a paramedic that I expect you guys to do, to accomplish. That's going to be the thing that saves the most lives, okay? Airway. Okay, obviously, just like we need oxygenated blood to keep the body alive, we have to have a means to oxygenate that blood, and that's what the airway gives us. The airway gives us a passage into the lungs, and the lungs can then, in combination with the heart, oxygenate the blood and keep us alive. And if that airway becomes closed or damaged in any way, the body is no longer able to oxygenate blood, and we are no longer able to keep the body alive. Now, it takes a little bit longer for a compromised airway to kill somebody, and that's why it's number 2 on our priority list. But it's still very, very important. Anybody ever ran a OD? Been around an overdose before? Good snoring respirations. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted you to hear, to visualize in your mind when you think closed airway. So basically what snoring is just the tongue closing the epiglottis, which is the little flap above the trachea. Okay, some signs and symptoms of airway. You might have an airway blockage, casualties in distress, and they can't breathe properly. Anybody have a kid with asthma or has ever had croup or epiglottitis? Casualties making snoring or gurgling sounds, like I said before. Visible blood or foreign objects are present in the airway, and severe trauma to the face. All can indicate airway compromise. And after we treat massive hemorrhage, we want to make sure that we give the patient as much of an airway as we can with the equipment that we have. And some of the best methods for doing this are just basic airway maneuvers. One of my favorites is if you go all the way over to the right, the recovery position, especially for an unconscious patient. The recovery position basically uses gravity. Instead of gravity being used against us, we're using gravity for us. So we're turning the patient so that their airway is with the pull of gravity. So we pull that tongue, gravity is pulling the tongue off of the epiglottis, and we're opening that airway. And now we can leave the patient. So we provided the patient with an open airway, and now we're free to do other stuff. And that's one of the reasons I love the recovery position. Is you're doing the most with the littlest amount of effort. Does that make sense? You're doing the most without using the most resources. Right? We always want to do more with less. Right? Some other things you can do: head tilt, chin lift, and a jaw thrust. Wish I brought the air with me. Obviously, if a patient is alert and breathing by themselves, you can always just say, hey, get into a position that's best for you, right? Because obviously if they're alert, they're going to know what position they want to be in. For the unconscious patients, you have the head tilt chin lift. Anybody ever performed a head tilt chin lift before? We'll get into that a little later. And then you have the jaw thrust. And those are called basic airway maneuvers. They're great, they work. But like I said, once you do that, we're kind of stuck, right? Somebody has to keep holding that airway open. And that's why I love the recovery position. Because when we're talking about TC3, when we're talking about austere environments, technical situations, we don't always have the resources we want, right? We don't always have a bunch of first responders. So we kind of have to make do with what we got. And that's why the recovery position is great, because one person can provide an airway and then move on and do other stuff to the patient. Any questions on airway?
With your experience, out of those three techniques, which one seems to be the most successful?
So, positioning works. We see less airway compromise because of trauma on the civilian EMS side of things. So for us, we're probably gonna go with a head tilt chin lift or a jaw thrust, just because we usually do have the resources. And usually it's a medical problem, stroke, heart attack, STEMI, stuff like that that's causing the airway compromise, and not necessarily trauma. And to secure that airway, eventually we need them in a supine position to tube them or intubate them or whatever we're gonna do. So usually our patients are supine and somebody's holding that airway open. But like I said, that's one person out of the fight. Right, that's one person that's stuck doing one thing. Now I have used the recovery position before and it works. It lets, even for an unconscious person, it lets blood drain. At the same time, it's pulling the tongue off of the epiglottitis. It's very effective, and you're actually getting an added benefit if you put the patient on their left side. So what happens is, and I'll give you a quick pathophys lesson here. So the great veins and arteries, the great veins are on the right side of the heart. So it's called the superior and inferior vena cava, and they're basically the great veins of the body, and they come into the heart on this side of the body. So what happens when we put a patient on their right side? Yeah, all that stuff comes over and we're putting pressure on the great veins of the body. Well, in order for the heart to contract effectively, it needs what's called preload. It needs a good return from the venous side of the body in order to stretch the cardiac muscle to get a good. It's almost like a balloon. Can you imagine a balloon? The more you blow it up and then release it, the more power you get when you let it go. The heart's the same way. The more pressure it gets on preload, the more effective it is contracting the cardiac muscle. And if we compress those great veins, we limit the body's ability to provide preload to the heart. So that's why we like the left lateral recumbent position, is it uses gravity in our favor once again to open up those great veins, and we're actually getting an increased heart contractility and afterload. So we're actually going to give the patient a little boost in blood pressure. So like I said, we're doing a lot with the recovery position, not just from an airway standpoint, but with so say we're on airway, we already treated massive hemorrhage. We just gave them a little bump in blood pressure, performing a little airway maneuver of recovery position. But to answer your question, the recovery position is the easiest one to put them in. It is effective. The basic airway maneuvers provide, they take a little bit of practice, and they can be difficult for even trained providers. You could have, so for example, you could have a clenched jaw. We run into that a lot, where the patient's doing this, but they're still unconscious, so we can't really open the airway. So yeah, I would say that the easiest thing for y'all is going to be the recovery position. One caveat I will add to that is any kind of head or spinal trauma, right? We don't really want to be, we want to be careful moving. So for example, y'all get to a scene and you kind of want to use some of the stuff you've learned in TC3 and just apply it to a call, like a motor vehicle accident that you respond to as a fire department. Well, you remember, well, I remember Cameron said something about, we'll put him in the recovery position, and, yeah, we'll just go ahead and do that. Well, in that situation, we've got to worry about spinal trauma too. So in that situation, you might go for a jaw thrust, because with a jaw thrust, you're not manipulating the spine or moving it around as much as with a recovery position. And all that manipulation and rotation you're causing to the spine and neck, you're not going to get that with a jaw thrust. So in answer to your question, the recovery position is effective if used correctly. And there are some situations where a basic airway maneuver is going to be more effective or more appropriate, I would say. Like when you have necessary resources to perform it and keep performing it, or when you have some sort of other injury that you think you might want to, okay, maybe we shouldn't roll them, we should probably just do a jaw thrust. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah.
Sweet.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was really long-winded.
Why did it say, not to do that if the patient was in shock, and where did it sign somebody going into shock?
Where did it say that?
On that last
Let's check that out.
They're unconscious. Not in shock.
Yeah, I would just say that's wrong. Yeah, I don't know why it says that.
What are the signs of somebody being in shock?
So, shock is so like you hear in the movies where like the guy's like frozen. It's like, oh, he's in shock. So, but once again, it gets a little bit more complicated than just shock. There are many different kinds of shock. There's cardiogenic shock, which is the kind of shock we get from heart failure or a heart attack. There's hemorrhagic shock, which is what we're going to be dealing with here. Basically, shock from a reduced blood volume from bleeding. There's obstructive shock. There's hypovolemic shock. There's distributive shock. There's just all kinds of shock out there. And if you take the word shock, what shock means is inadequate tissue perfusion. So any state the body is in that it is not able to provide its extremities or cells with adequate nutrients, oxygen, that's going to be a state of shock. Some objective signs we see with that are altered mental status. First of all, your mental status, any kind of heart rhythm changes like a tachycardia because the body's trying to compensate, a loss in blood pressure or a drop in blood pressure, and the skin. The skin will tell you a lot. White, pale, cold, sweaty, those are all signs of shock. So if you see a guy who has a traumatic wound, who has a tourniquet on, and they're sweating, but they're cold and they're pale, that would be a sign of shock, right? And I don't know why. I don't know why it says that. I would probably disagree with that. And the reason I would disagree with that is I'm assuming that that girl right there is alone, and she's all that guy has. And so she can either get stuck on airway, or she can provide an airway and then move on to something else that might be killing her. Right? So I would say that, yeah, I don't know why it says that.
I think she's picking his pocket trying to get his cell phone out.
Looks like it. So what she's doing right there is adjusting the knee so that it's propping him up. So you see his right arm is underneath his chin, the left arm's kind of extended, and then you see the right leg is kind of in an L shape underneath the body. That's just acting as like a pillar to keep him from just going prone. We don't want him prone, just on his belly, because that's gonna restrict bleeding or breathing. That's gonna do all sorts of negative things we don't want. We want him on his side. We wanna keep him on his side. Does that answer your question? We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, I think that's been about 45 minutes. So we'll take a break till 20, and then continue on with respiration. March acronym is going to be R, which stands for respirations. So the body needs blood to oxygenate, deliver nutrients to the rest of the body. It needs an airway to be able to oxygenate that blood, and it needs to be able to breathe through that airway, right? Okay. So the next part of our assessment, after we assess for and treat massive hemorrhage, airway, we're going to assess for respiratory distress. Some signs of respiratory distress include difficulty breathing, either struggling to get air in or out. Breathing is too weak to be effective, and anybody who's ever seen a overdose has probably witnessed this. They just kind of have that shallow, slow, ineffective respiratory drive with the snoring respirations. That's the kind of stuff it's talking about. Or rapid breathing. Anybody ever been around like an asthmatic, or actually a perfect example is, has anybody ever ran 2 miles before? Okay. So you breathe faster because your body's trying to keep up with the demand that you're placing on it. So if you have a combat casualty who is breathing rapidly, we know that one, it's either from the situation and he's under a lot of stress, or two, the body's trying to compensate for some kind of insult or injury to it. These signs may also indicate a penetrating chest wound. So, one of the big differences between military trauma and civilian trauma is the body armor. Civilians, teachers, kids don't wear body armor in elementary schools. And so, on the military side, what we may see is massive extremity hemorrhage, but the guy also had 3 to his plate. So where he would have had 3 chest wounds, he's just got extremities. That same guy on the civilian side, not wearing body armor, has extremity hemorrhage and penetrating chest wounds. And so that's one of the main differences between civilian trauma and military trauma, is the location of the injury. In an active shooter event, or somebody who's trained at all with a weapon, training is usually center of mass, right? Center of mass is chest and abdomen. Nobody is really shooting for an extremity. You may get an extremity because you're a bad shot, but if you're aiming for center of mass, and you're a good shot, that's likely where the bullet's going to go. So we're going to see a lot more. We're likely to see a lot more core damage and trauma on the civilian side than we are the military side. Does that make sense to everybody? Because soldiers are wearing body armor, right? They're wearing headgear. They're wearing front and back plates. They're wearing side plates. Sometimes they're wearing soft armor on the necks, the shoulder. They're wearing shoulder pauldrons. So they're going to be a lot more protected than a 7 or 8 year old who's at an elementary school, or a teacher who's at a principal who's at an elementary school, or even us if we're at a grocery store shopping with our family. When's the last time anybody wore concealed plates at Bill's? Probably never, because that would be weird. You would look at that guy and be like, he's a threat. I need to keep my eye on that guy. That's not right. Okay, so assess for potential life-threatening chest injuries. So obviously right there on the left, we have a penetrating chest wound, looks like a gunshot to the left chest. And then we have a blast injury. Obviously, has everybody seen a bullet hole before? A bullet hole in a person? Anybody? Nobody? They can be small. They can be really small. Now in the if we have, let me roll back a second. Let's look at that leftmost picture right there. We've got a penetrating chest wound. The reason this is a big deal is the body's respiratory system works on what's called a negative pressure system. So when your diaphragm contracts, it increases the space in the vacuum, which is your thoracic cavity, and the lungs are then inflated from that negative pressure. So they're pulled apart by that negative pressure. Does that make sense? When that negative pressure atmosphere is compromised and we get air into what's supposed to be a vacuum, what can happen is instead of water, it always takes what? The path of least resistance. So if we've got a 2 centimeter diameter hole here and a 2 centimeter diameter hole here, where do you think air is going to want to enter when your diaphragm contracts and you try to take a breath in? This guy. And what that's going to do is it can create what's called a sucking chest wound. So when you breathe in, air will enter into the thoracic cavity and it'll stay there. It'll start building up. Well, that buildup of air will cause the lungs to slowly collapse. And when the lungs collapse, that's not good because if you have a hole in a balloon and you try to fill it up, it's not going to work. So when the lungs collapse, they can't fill up adequately with air, and they can't oxygenate the body. It's also a bad thing because that pressure just keeps building and building, and it can actually compress the heart. It can move all the way over to where it's compressing the heart, and it's compressing the opposite lung. And that's what's called a tension pneumothorax. What I just described to you is called a tension pneumothorax. And so if you break down the word pneumothorax, everybody knows what the thorax is. There's a thoracic cavity. Pneumo meaning air, and tension. So we have air in the thorax that's under tension, right? There's pressure there. And that pressure is causing lung collapse, cardiac tamponade, and opposite lung collapse. Blast injuries. Has anybody ever heard of your waves or your stages of blast injury? So with any kind of blast injury, we have basically 4 mechanisms that we have to deal with. We have the initial, when an explosion goes off, we have, and you know, there was just a bomb threat the other day, I think, at McDonald's. So if anybody's sitting here thinking, oh well, you know, Frank County never have anything like that, that's what everybody always says.
But the bank down here was robbed with a pipe bomb.
Telling you. And not only that, I mean, everybody knows there's drugs in the county. You got meth labs, and that stuff. If it's not done right, they can blow up. So any kind of blast injury, we're going to be dealing with 4 different types of mechanisms of trauma. So your initial is obviously going to be your overpressure wave. So your overpressure wave is, say I'm right next to a device that goes off. The first thing that's going to hit me is the overpressure wave. So maybe we get some eardrum rupture. Maybe it's powerful enough to cause me to pop a lung. Can actually cause you to pop a lung. But that's the first thing anybody next to a blast injury is going to be dealing with, is the overpressure wave. The second phase is going to be stuff hitting you. So now we have a penetrating mechanism. So any kind of debris that blast and overpressure wave has following it is going to hit me. And that's the second wave I'm dealing with. The third thing I'm going to have to deal with is me hitting other stuff. So with a blast wave powerful enough, we get an overpressure wave, we get projectiles from that wave, and then we get me thrown into a brick wall. Okay, so that's your third. Your fourth wave is gonna be contamination. So at that point, we're talking nuclear, biological, chemical, dirty bombs, even, so one of the things they used to do do overseas is they would make coats projectiles and shit. So not only are you dealing with a projectile that's in the patient, you're also dealing with contamination that they have put on that projectile, and now you have to deal with that on top of everything else. So that's gonna be your fourth wave. So those are the 4 waves of blast injuries. So the initial overpressure, stuff hitting me hitting stuff, and the fallout effect, which is gonna be your CBRN stuff, which hazmat. You guys are fire. Hazmat. It's basically your 4th wave is dealing with the hazmat stuff, the hazmat side of things. Let's see, so anytime we have a penetrating chest trauma, we wanna check for what? Exit wounds, right? This is one thing where I really don't care which one is the exit wound and which one is the entrance wound. When you have 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, you just have 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, right? When you're talking about medical treatment, they're both gonna be treated the same way. And what we wanna do is, we wanna return the body to as much of its original state as we can. So there's a puncture here, so what do we wanna do? We wanna seal it, right? We wanna seal that puncture so the air is going the correct way. We're not getting air into the penetrating wound, and it's not trapping. We've sealed it, so we've returned, we've given the chest wall back its integrity, basically. We do this with a chest seal. It's basically a really, really sticky piece of like rubbery plastic. And I'm not gonna show you those right now because unlike tourniquets and stuff, once you take them out, they're pretty much done, but you will see those tomorrow. You don't need a brand name chest seal. You can use a chest seal with any non-porous material. Saran wrap. I met a medic one time that said that he carried saran wrap in his med bag. One of the things he would do one of his plans was if he had penetrating chest trauma, he would just roll the chest with saran wrap. And that way you have that sealing effect. You're restoring that integrity to the chest wall, and you're sealing those penetrating chest wounds. Blast injury, like I said, you're dealing with a barrage of different stuff. You're dealing with overpressure, you're dealing with projectiles, you're dealing with me being tossed, you're dealing with hazmat. So maybe you have more blunt, you have penetrating, but you also have blunt trauma that you have to deal with. And what it's basically saying right here is you need to recognize it. You need to be able to recognize that the patient has not just a penetrating injury, which we're gonna immediately treat, but we wanna recognize that they have any kind of blunt injury as well, because those can be just as dangerous. It may not take may not be as fast as penetrating chest trauma, but a contusion of the lung from blunt trauma, for example, unseatbelted driver chest impact from, say, a head-on or something like that, we can get some really major lung damage from just that blunt injury. Not only lung damage, but all kinds of bad stuff. Just heart, great veins. So blunt injury can be just as devastating as penetrating injury. Sometimes even more so. So obviously, if you have a penetrating chest injury, you're going to want to roll to examine the front and back for significant torso trauma. So also remember that just because they were shot in the chest doesn't mean that if we do have an exit wound, it doesn't mean the exit wound has to be in the chest. Exit wounds can be anywhere, just like a lightning strike. It can it's gonna do, especially 22s or small caliber ammunition. It kind of gets in there and ding, 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 kind of bounces around a little bit. So this is why it's important to roll. It's important to lift up the arms, because then things like the hide, like ticks. So just make sure you're doing a thorough assessment when you're assessing the chest. Make sure you're especially on, you know, another advantage the military has is most of its patients are combat age males in fairly good physical condition, right? Unlike what you will find at an elementary school, right? We're gonna see more obesity on the civilian side of things, because civilians don't have to pass a PT test to be civilians, right? They're just civilians. So we need to look under folds of skin, under breasts. The crease of the breast can hide stuff. You need to pick up breasts if you're, so say you're assessing, I mean, I'm sure we have some older ladies working in the elementary schools. So like, think about that. You're not just, you're gonna be treating the gender populations that's represented here. You're gonna be treating females, older men, children, if worse comes to worst. So we want to think about that, because the bullets could be hiding. And on an elderly female, there's gonna be more places for it to hide. So we really need to roll, we need to assess, we need to move folds of skin, to make sure that we're not missing any wounds, okay? Okay, one thing we do not do with chest wounds is we do not pack them, which I'm sure is kind of common sense. We don't want to put cotton gauze into the thoracic cavity, right? We want to seal the thoracic cavity. So we do not pack chest wounds. We pack extremities, we pack junctional areas, right? So maybe an armpit. If you have an armpit wound that's not sucking and you don't think that it's penetrating the chest cavity, you can pack that. So your junctional areas are going to be your main areas that you're going to utilize wound packing. The chest, what we're worried about is sealing it, right? We want to restore as much chest wall integrity as we can and get the body back to its negative pressure system of breathing. Obviously, anything we find, we want to report to medical personnel. That's a no-brainer. Any questions on respiration?
The chest seal is a lot of blood squirting out. Can it keep the seal from sticking and tearing loose and backing off?
So,
Or are they so sticky that they can't overcome it?
so you want to wipe, before you apply the chest seal, you want to wipe away any blood. That's not a chest seal. I'll show you one in the pack. Yes, so the stickiness of the chest seal will be affected by any kind of fluid, water, or blood that's on or around the wound. So you want to take the patient's shirt, take your shirt, take a cloth, wipe that as much as possible so that you get maximum adhesion.
Now, aren't some of them valved or vented somehow?
Yes, yep, so some of them are vented. The reason for that is if so say we have a gunshot wound to the chest and we seal everything up. Well, it took us 5 minutes to seal everything up. So in that amount of time, it's likely that we've had air get into the chest cavity. The theory behind a vented chest seal is that when the diaphragm contracts on inspiration, when the patient breathes in, it gets sucked to the chest wall. Just like if somebody were to put a plastic bag over your head and you take a breath in, that plastic bag goes like that. So with a vented chest seal, the theory is on inspiration, it gets sucked to the chest, restoring chest wall integrity, but on expiration, or breathing out, that air that's been trapped in there is now forced out. So we're kind of doing both. Now the military has been sort of back and forth on this, whether or not they like it vented, whether or not they don't want it vented. I would say that for your guys' sake, we're just worried about sealing the chest, okay? Yeah, just make sure the chest is sealed. Because eventually that patient's gonna get a chest tube, or we're gonna decompress the chest or something like that. So you guys, as far as you're concerned, we're just sealing the chest. So if you were to go and buy your own chest seals, it doesn't matter if they're vented or not. I would just get the non-vented chest seals. Let's see, circulation. Okay, so just like the body needs blood to give nutrients and oxygen to the cells, just like it needs an airway to get that oxygen in, just like it needs to breathe, the body needs to circulate all that blood. And so what we're doing in circulation is we're reassessing everything we've done so far when it comes to bleeding control. So if we put that tourniquet on high and tight, if we put a deliberate tourniquet on, we're gonna reassess that, and we're gonna make sure that sucker's not bleeding anymore. Does that make sense? So just like I'm sure on the fire side, you guys are, once you do something initially, there is a recheck, right? I don't know, you may tell me. There's a recheck of that, and we do the same thing on the medical side of things. We reassess things that we've done to control bleeding, to make sure that they're still working. And if they're not working, we need to fix it. Okay, so in this one, we're also gonna be trying to prevent shock. We're gonna reassess all bleeding control measures and make sure they're still effective. We're gonna ensure that tourniquets remain tight. So while we were doing everything else, the guy decides to loosen his tourniquet, and now there's blood all over the floor. Well, okay, so we're gonna retighten that tourniquet, make sure it stays tight. Consider elevating both legs higher than the casualty's heart if their airway tolerates lying flat on their back. So what this is gonna do is it's gonna use the force of gravity to pull blood back towards the lung, heart, lung, liver, brains, and kidney, the big five. Because those are the things we need to keep functioning so that we don't lose our patient. And that's the reason we can put the legs up. All right, signs and symptoms of shock. Who was it asked about shock? Rapid breathing, losing focus and having difficulty engaging. So loss of mental acuity, right? Whenever you ever just been really tired before? You can't do math really tired as good as you can, when you're not tired. I can't do math in either of those conditions very well, but definitely when I'm not tired, you just don't have the mental acuity. So, especially if you've gone without a meal all day, and you've been active all day, you've probably felt something like that, some kind of fatigue or just kind of that rundown feeling. Just imagine that feeling, and then just imagine not having all of your blood volume, and imagine how that could affect your mental acuity. So losing focus, having difficulty engaging, sweaty, cool, clammy skin, and pale and gray skin. The skin is sweaty, cool, clammy, pale, and gray because the body is either doesn't have enough blood to circulate around, or it's recognized that it's losing blood and it's started to clamp off the extremities so that it can shunt blood to the core. Like I said, keep the big five running: heart, lung, liver, brain, kidneys. Hypothermia. Okay, so makes sense that a person that doesn't have, we're what? We are warm-blooded creatures, correct? Warm-blooded. It makes sense that if we lose some of that blood, we may get cold. And this is a problem for various reasons, and I'm gonna go into a quick little pathophys lesson. If you get it, great. If you don't, great. So the reason hypothermia is so important is everybody should have heard in high school the word homeostasis. Not homeostasis. So basically, the body has a narrow range of pH, acidity that it has to keep. It has a narrow range of temperature that it has to keep in order to survive, in order to keep on living. The reason that is your body is made up of all kinds of proteins. If you can imagine a protein, the form of a protein always follows its function. So it's going to be shaped in a way that helps it, that allows it to do its job. So for example, if you have a hose nozzle, it's made of metal, and it's shaped in a certain way, the gaskets are in a certain place, and the on-off valve is shaped in a certain way, and the gaskets and nuts and bolts and screws are in a certain place. Well, imagine that hose nozzle only stays together if it's in a certain range of temperature or a certain range of acidity. And if it gets out of that range of acidity, it starts to melt. It starts to lose its form, its shape. And when it loses its shape, it can no longer do its job. If the throw lever melts away, there's no way for you to turn it off and on. If the gaskets melt away, the thing is busted. It's gonna seep all over the place everywhere. If you don't have, the hose that diverts the pressure to shoot the water, you're not gonna be able to shoot the water, right? It's just gonna go all over the place. Now imagine that your clotting mechanisms are proteins, which they are, and they're shaped a certain way to clot blood in case of hemorrhage. Now imagine that you're cold and those clotting proteins start to lose their shape. Is that starting to sink in for everybody? And now imagine that the body is full of reactions and actions that are all being performed by proteins that have to have a certain shape in order to perform their function. And so when we get out of that narrow range of acidity and temperature, those proteins start to literally fall apart. And so the body those proteins are incapable of performing their function. And one example of that is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, does anybody remember from school what hemoglobin does? It carries oxygen. And it's shaped a certain way in order to carry the molecule of oxygen. Well, if that shape degrades, it can no longer carry oxygen. So now you see the kind of cascade effect we can get. We've treated all these things, but then we allow our patient to become hypothermic. We have a cascade, literally the entire body, which is made up of proteins, is just degrading because we're failing to do this one thing. And if they've lost enough blood, passive warming is not going to be enough. If they've lost enough blood, they cannot warm themselves. So at that point, we're talking about active warming. With hypothermia, I would warm, if the patient is conscious and can talk to you, I would warm till they are comfortable. You are probably going to be hot. So if we're dealing with a trauma patient in the back of the ambulance, usually one of the first things we do is we crank the heat all the way up, and we're like pouring sweat. But we're doing that to ensure that patient, which can no longer maintain their temperature in order to survive, we're making sure that they are warm enough so that those proteins can stay in the shape that they have so that they can perform their function. So that's why hypothermia is so important. Very, very critical. Okay, prevent, address hypothermia worsened by massive blood loss. That's what we just talked about. This is not hypothermia due to cold weather, and that's important to note because the way we treat hypothermia in cold weather is much more methodical, and it has to be done in a way that's very controlled and slow in order so we don't kill the person. So this is, just keep in your mind that this is preventing and addressing hypothermia from hemorrhagic shock, from bleeding loss, or from massive loss of blood. To prevent hypothermia, keep clothing on the casualty unless extremely wet. Unless it's extremely wet, then remove. That makes sense to everybody, right? If you jump into a lake with blue jeans on, cotton shirt on, and then you get out, you're probably, the clothing on your body is that's why we wear cotton shirts in the summer, because it soaks up the sweat, and it's able to wick that heat away from our bodies more effectively. Well, that becomes a negative thing when we're talking about trauma patients. So we want to remove wet clothing. We want to recover them with dry clothing. Cover the pet casualty with blankets, poncho liners, sleeping bags, or anything that will retain heat. Now, like I said before, there's a caveat to that, because if they're not able to produce their own heat, if they're at a point to where they're so bad off and they've lost enough blood to where they can't produce their own heat, then a sleeping bag isn't going to do much. You're going to need to think active rewarming at that point. Keep the casualty off the ground, increases loss of body heat. I'm sure everybody in here has gone camping. Used a camping mat as opposed to if you slept on the snow, you'd be much colder than if you used a camping mat, right? Because it's that insulating layer. So we want to keep the casualty off the ground, because we lose body heat a lot faster to the ground than we do the air. Some signs of hypothermia: slurred speech or mumbling, slow breathing, drowsiness, and shivering. Obviously shivering. If you see a trauma patient shivering, this is no bueno. Any questions? All right, we're going to go real quick into some other injuries you may see. You may see eye trauma, head trauma, burns, fractures. I will touch on eye and head injury. Basically, there. Obviously, we're so far down in the algorithm now. We're never going to treat eye trauma over massive hemorrhage. Everybody's got that right. We march first. So massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, hypothermia, and then we can maybe start to get into these secondary injuries. But keep in mind, these are secondary injuries. These are probably not going to kill the patient, except for maybe head injury. With these, for you guys, I would say the number one thing we need y'all to do is to prevent further injury to that injury. So for the eye trauma, we can cover it. We don't want to put pressure on it. For the head injury, we have a lot of things we're going to do for a head injury, especially if it's symptomatic. So for a head injury, there's not much you guys are going to be able to do except maybe just prevent further injury to that injury. Okay? Burns and fractures. All right, if a penetrating eye injury is noted or suspected, shield the injured eye. Cover the eye with a rigid eye shield, not a pressure patch, so that goes back to not putting pressure on it. Place a shield over the injured eye, not both eyes, and tape in place. If no rigid eye shield is available, tactical eyewear can also be used to protect the eye. Important, do not apply pressure.
Wouldn't you want to cover both eyes with penetrating? Because your eyes follow each other?
So I think I've actually heard it both ways before. If I think about it, it makes sense. I sort of want the patient to be blind, because like you said, if he's got one eye open and it can see, he's going to try to track stuff with that eye, just instinctively. So this is probably going to be something where it's going to be patient by patient. We don't really want him to move to the eye. If it's a penetrating injury and we have a foreign body in the eye, at that point we're not going to try to cover it. We're just going to try to secure it in place. We're not going to try to remove it either. But yeah, I don't know. I've heard it both ways. In my mind, I would almost rather have them blind. I guess if I think about it, and I was blind and couldn't see anything, and I heard something over here, I might be tempted to shift my eye eyes, even though I can't see, there may still be that reaction. And maybe having an open eye, we can instruct the patient to remain fixed on an object. Say, I don't know. I would say for that, whatever works for the patient. Burns, superficial. I've got some of these right now on my neck. Pressure washed my driveway the other day, stayed out too long. First degree burns are like sunburn, the reddened appearance of the skin. I'm sure everybody's gotten sunburn in here. Well, if you've gotten sunburn before, you have had first degree burns. Partial thickness burns, second degree burns. This is gonna be, you see you have the sunburn type first degree on the outside, and then you have the blister. Okay, well that's just fluid building up underneath the skin, and that's just gonna be a partial thickness burn. I don't even know what I'm talking about, you guys are firefighters. Do y'all cover stuff like that, types of burns? Or how, so we need to stay on this slide now. Okay. Full thickness burns. Third degree burns may appear dry, stiff, leathery, or can also be white, brown, black. This is total tissue destruction. If you had to remember just a quick phrase for third degree burns, this is tissue destruction. And then I think they're even doing a fourth degree burn nowadays, which is a burn that has proceeded all the way down to the bone level. So if you can see bone, if bone has been burned, then that's going to be a fourth degree burn. And then obviously you have your hazmat burns and stuff like that, which are still going to be classified the same in the, by degree. Burn care. Keep in mind that burn care is a distracting injury for the provider. Burns are painful, they are gross when they are bad. They are terrible injuries. And they can distract you from things that are gonna kill the patient first. So just keep in mind that burns, no matter how hideous, are secondary injuries. Right? We always stick, we always march first. And when we get to the point where we can treat burns, we're going to cover the burn area with dry and sterile dressings. Obviously, we want to stop the burning process first. Be careful when you do that, though, because if they are burned all over their body, one thing that skin does for us is it helps us maintain temperature. And if the skin has been compromised enough, then we are incapable of maintaining our temperature effectively. So if we start pouring water on a burn patient that has over, say, 30% burns to the chest, neck, abdomen, all that kind of stuff, then we have to be very careful with that, because what does water do? It cools us down. Obviously, we want to stop the burning process, but we don't want to go too far. Does that make sense? We're going to cover the burn area with dry, sterile dressings. We're going to cover the casualty to prevent heat loss and keep the casualty dry. In case of electrical injury, secure the power if possible. Otherwise, remove the casualty from the electrical source using non-conductive objects such as a wooden stick, and move the casualty to a safe place. Fractures. These are actually, we see these pretty common with good motor vehicle accidents. Assessing for fracture. Warning signs of fracture: significant pain and swelling, an audible perceived snap, different length or shape of the limb. So if you look at the guy's legs, and one leg is shorter than the other, that's called shortening. You can also have rotation. If it looks angled or rotated in a weird way, then you can start thinking about fracture. Loss of pulse or sensation in the injured arm or leg. Obviously bones, if they snap, can be sharp, and they can damage a whole lot of venous and arterial blood vessels. And crepitus. Crepitus is like a crackling or popping sound under the skin. So if you move a leg and it goes, probably pretty indicative of a fracture. You have closed and open fractures. What will we maybe think of to do to this open fracture that we wouldn't necessarily think about doing to this closed fracture? I mean, yeah, that fracture looks nasty, but once again, what do we always do first? Tourniquet. So if we have this fracture, the bone is showing, we have massive bleeding, we're gonna tourniquet that injury, okay? Regardless of if it's, of what causes the massive hemorrhage, we're still gonna march first, okay? Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay, splinting. Splint is used to prevent movement and hold an injured arm or leg in place, and we want to hold it in place because we want to prevent further damage to the already damaged fracture. You can use a semi-rigid splint. Everybody ever held a SAM splint before? It's basically a thin piece of aluminum that's covered by foam, and so it's semi-rigid, but it's pliable at the same time, so you can form it.
You got one of them?
I think all the old first responders were taught that, had issued those, but the last few classes have not been
Yeah.
given those.
Yep. Or improvise using rigid or bulky materials, boards, boxes, tree limbs, and even weapons. Incorporate the joint above and below the fracture. So what it's talking about is, when we're talking about splinting, we're gonna be dealing with joints and bones. So if we have a fracture of a bone, we want to immobilize the joint below and the joint above that bone. If we have what we think is a joint injury, we want to immobilize the bone below and the bone above that injury. So you see how it flip-flops? And we immobilize above and below because we want to get rid of, we want to immobilize any kind of muscles that are going to cause that injury to worsen. So obviously, if we've got a knee, we want to immobilize this bone, that way that knee doesn't work, the knee doesn't move. If we have a tib fib fracture, a bone fracture, we want to immobilize the ankle and the knee. Right? So just remember, bone fracture, joint above, joint below, joint injury, bone above, bone below. Okay? Assess for head injury. Head injuries can be the result of blunt force, acceleration, deceleration. We were talking about the motor vehicle accident before, where you have the patient going into the steering wheel. Well, the brain sits inside the skull, right? And the brain is basically just soft tissue. Well, the skull is not soft tissue. So when we have accelerating or massive decelerating forces applied to the brain, what is it gonna do? It's gonna slosh. It's gonna slosh inside the skull cavity. And the skull basically becomes one of the mechanisms of injury. And at that point, we have blunt injury to the brain caused by the skull that was caused by the decelerating forces. You ever been, and some of you, anybody football players in here? You get ring, you get your bell rung a little bit. Well, that was just getting that decelerating, accelerating force applied to your brain inside your skull. It's just that, kind of shaking around it does. If it's bad enough, we can cause all sorts of injury. Explosion, blast events, motor vehicle collisions, rollovers, falls, sports injuries. Usually gunshot wounds, stabbings, or fragmentation from explosives. You can have blunt and penetrating head injury, obviously. Signs and symptoms may include an altered level of consciousness. Just like if we have a broken femur, we have an impairment. We're going to have an impairment of that leg. We're probably not going to be able to sprint on that leg. If we have a damaged brain, our mentation is affected. So that's where that altered level of consciousness comes from. Disorientation, dizziness, headache, just like if we injure a leg and it hurts, if we injure the brain, it can hurt, headache. Ear ringing, amnesia, nausea, vomiting, and double vision, all signs of headache. You have encountered an active shooter situation. An unconscious casualty has sustained multiple gunshot wounds. Your assessment reveals the following: 2 open chest wounds from apparent gunshots, a bright red squirting from the lower right thigh, and the casualty is in respiratory distress. What is the most important priority in the care of this casualty?
Three.
Who says 1? Who says 2? Who says 3? Who says 4? Okay, so it's gonna be 3, right? Because we always march first. So we're gonna apply a tourniquet to the right thigh because the massive bleeding is gonna kill him before any compromise to his respiration's on. Actually, if we were in this kind of situation, what would we see? See if we can get some people to answer this. So, say we have encountered an active shooter situation, and there is an unconscious casualty that has sustained multiple gunshot wounds. What is really the first priority here?
The shooter.
Scene safe.
The shooter. That's exactly right. What is the only thing, if anything, we're gonna do for this guy?
High and tight.
High and tight tourniquet. We're gonna go high and tight. We're gonna go over the clothing. Remember, a hasty tourniquet is always over the clothing, high and tight on the affected limb. And we're gonna control that bleeding for him, if it's safe to do so. And then we're gonna move on and try to eliminate the threat. And if it's not safe to do so, we're just gonna move on, okay? Prevent further loss of life.
So not worrying about a chest seal.
Nope, we're not, and when we're talking about care under fire, we're
Yeah.
not worried about a chest seal. That's gonna come in phase 2, which is gonna be tactical field care. And that's when we start, using our March algorithm to assess the patient and prioritize our treatment plan and treat him. All right, we really didn't cover documentation because, whatever. Just remember the things you do. I would say it's very important to pass on to medical personnel what you have seen, what you have done to the patient. But the likelihood that you are gonna have documentation with you is very low. So we didn't really cover that.
Do you document the time that the tourniquet is applied?
That is very important. So, it's not important enough to risk your life. Don't document the time in care under fire when the scene is unsafe. If you have time, document the time. One thing I'll say is that I can always go back and look at when shit popped off and guesstimate when that tourniquet went on within 30 minutes or so, right? So say, everybody has active 911 in here. So I can go back and look, and if you're like, man, I really don't remember the time it went on, I can go back and look, okay, dispatch, first unit got dispatched, when the call came in at 18:30, okay. First unit was on scene at this point, so we'll guesstimate within 30 minutes, right there. The surgeon's gonna do his own assessment of if the tourniquet has stayed on too long or not. So while it is important, and while if you have the time, definitely document the time on the tourniquet. I would say that it's not life or death, and we can guesstimate a time well enough to provide to the hospital to provide good care. Okay, so I'm going to mention this real quick. this is probably one of the best things to ever come out of the military, honestly. It's called Deployed Medicine. Deployed Medicine is a government, it's a government website, it's government funded. It's a free source, so you can go online and get your own free account right now. It's basically, this course is, I pulled this course off of that website. You can get it on Android, it's available on iPhone. Some of the stuff they provide is videos. There's lots of videos on tourniquet applications. There's wound packing videos. There's airway maneuver videos, which we'll get more into the practical stuff tomorrow. But all that stuff, like we're going to be looking at the videos tomorrow, and we're going to be practicing based off those videos. And all that stuff is available to you at any time. So if you're just sitting on your sofa at home, and you're like, when do I apply a tourniquet, or when do I apply a chest seal, or in what way do I apply a chest seal? You have immediate access to that video. You can download it into your library, or you can just stream it online. And it's they're usually like 2 to 3 minute long instructional videos. It's one of the best resources, hands down, that has ever come out of the military. Great resource. I highly recommend you getting it and downloading it on your phone.
That way you can use it on the call.
That's exactly right. And I had it on my phone overseas because there's it's got all the it's got resources for combat medics as far as like medication dosages and stuff like that. So it's basically the culmination of everything we've learned in military medicine is put into this website and on that app, to the point of like definitive care as well. So there's stuff in there that's way beyond me. So like there's surgical stuff in there. Like they basically took out all their knowledge and just put it into an app for everybody, no matter what level of care you are. You can have access to it. So it's a great free resource. It's totally free. Just get a free account, and you can train whenever you want to. So guys, that is that's the lecture part of things. And it is 9 o'clock, so we've reached the end of tonight. Tomorrow will be more hands-on. We'll get into actually getting our hands on some of these things, utilizing some technique to apply them on our partners, neighbors. We'll get into assessments, utilizing our March algorithm within the appropriate phase of care. And then hopefully we'll have enough time for a good, to build some teams and go through some culminating exercises. And I think maybe even a wound packing thing. And if we can't get the meat, I can rig some stuff up with portable boxes. So that's all I have for you tonight. If you have any questions,